Let's start this hour with something that sounds, frankly, like something straight out of a sci-fi novel. But NASA says a nuclear reactor on the moon could be a reality by 2030, laying the foundation for a future moon base that hosts humans. But a lot has to happen between now and then for that to happen. Philip Ferguson's an associate professor of mechanical engineering here in Manitoba. He's at the University of Manitoba and the director of STARlab. Now, he's also president of the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute. Here's part of what he said about the story and he had a conversation with Up to Speed guest host Cory Funk.
When you first saw that announcement that NASA wants to build a nuclear reactor on the moon by 2030, what went through your mind?
Well, while the time frame seems a little questionable, given how difficult it is to get to the moon, the idea of putting a reactor on the moon really makes sense, just because it's one of the very few power sources that we have available to us when we're trying to do things on the moon, like do research.
It was funny because at first, the first thing I thought, it's kind of almost sounded like something a cartoon villain would do, like I'll build a nuclear reactor on the moon. But obviously it's not. But so can you just kind of explain to me, why? Why a nuclear reactor on the moon? You kind of gave a nice brief explanation there, but go into a little more depth for us.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So most of the things that we put into space now, like in orbit around the Earth, we use solar power. And that's because a lot of the time we're orbiting the Earth, we are in bright sunlight. But the moon has much, much, much longer days than Earth. A day on the moon lasts an entire month. So that means 2 weeks of the day are in bright sunlight, and the following 2 weeks are in dark nighttime. And so what that means is that not only are you extremely hot for 2 weeks because you're in bright sun constantly, but then you're extremely cold for those 2 weeks of nighttime, and you can't generate any power using solar panels in the middle of that lunar night. So really what it comes down to is we either need to have really, really, really big batteries that we can charge during the 2 weeks of sunlight and discharge them for the next 2 weeks when it's nighttime, or we use an alternative form of energy, and the most obvious one is nuclear power.
2030, even me, who doesn't know much about how to build nuclear reactors on the moon, thought that seems ambitious. So what do you think? You think it's possible?
I do think it's possible. I mean, the idea of putting reactors in space is not new. We have often used thermonuclear generators on other satellites, especially those that go deep, deep into the solar system, so far away from the sun that there isn't enough photons to generate enough electricity. So building reactors for space is not new. However, landing anything on another planet, whether it be Mars or the moon or an asteroid or something like that, is always difficult. We've seen many different commercial companies and space agencies recently try to land things on the moon, and most of them have not been successful. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible, of course. I mean, we're trying to do that, and actually one of our Canadian astronauts will encircle the moon in the next couple of years. But anytime you put anything into space, it's hard, and it's even harder when you try to land that thing on another planetary body. Some of the challenges that we need to go through in order to get something into space, well, it starts with the launch, right? So rockets that launch into space, they shake a lot. And generally, the reactors that we design here on the ground are not being designed to be shaken. And so certainly securing the fuel, making sure that that's safe during the launch aspect is difficult. We also have space radiation, and while that might seem strange because we associate nuclear power with radiation, it's a much different kind of radiation that we experience in space, and so protecting the electronics that drive these reactors against space radiation, in particular the Van Allen radiation belts which lie between Earth and the moon, that's a challenge. And then, of course, landing on the moon is difficult too. And this is where many of these recent missions have failed, in part due to thrusters and other sensors working properly, often on the far side of the moon when they go to land. That can be a challenge. And then, of course, we come back to thermal, right? So these devices need to work in the bright sunlight for 2 weeks, where they just bake in the sun, and then they need to operate for 2 weeks in the deep, dark cold, which, we like to think that we here in Manitoba are used to cold winters, but that's nothing compared to what a 2-week nighttime is like on the moon.
I also can't help but think, like nuclear reactors, like if it explodes, what does that mean for the moon and for us? Like, are the tides going to be impacted? Like, should we worry about that?
Well, in theory, I suppose yes. However, what we're talking about here are very small amounts of radioactive and nuclear fuel. So even if one of these devices were to explode, it would be a very bad day on the moon, and it would really put into question our ability to do research on the moon, and certainly that area of the moon. But I don't think it's a credible threat for us to think that the moon will explode and be gone and then all of a sudden change tides. The moon is very far away, and the moon, for all that it is much smaller than the Earth, is still a very, very, very large item. And so no, I don't think we need to worry about life on Earth if something were to explode on the moon. However, there are concerns about rockets exploding on the way to the moon, and that is something that needs to have some serious consideration about the reliability and the path that those rockets take as they leave Earth. But again, that's not something that that is new to us. We often do planning like that for interplanetary spacecraft. So I think really it's an engineering challenge from a thermal perspective and from a structural vibration type perspective.
That was part of a conversation with Philip Ferguson and Up to Speed guest host Cory Funk, an associate professor. Philip Ferguson is an associate professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Manitoba and also director of its STARlab. He's also president of the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute. If you want to hear that full conversation, by the way, you can check out our CBC Manitoba Listen app.